Imagine being tied with thick rope and dragged beneath the barnacle-crusted hull of a wooden ship, where even the sea could become a tool of punishment. This wasn't fiction. It was keelhauling, a form of maritime discipline so feared its name alone sent shivers through European navies. Keelhauling was never devised for theatrical cruelty. It served a cold utilitarian purpose: to enforce discipline by fear. In an age where mutiny could collapse empires and undermine the foundations of naval command, punishments had to be so severe that the memory of them alone kept men obedient. The earliest documented practice of keelhauling in European navies appears in records from the Dutch Navy. It was employed, though rarely and not always lethally, during the mid-17th century. A well-known painting by Liev Pieters, Verschoya, dated circa 1660-1686, and now in the Rijksmuseum, vividly illustrates the punishment underway aboard Admiral Jan van Nees's ship in the presence of a large audience. The Dutch word keelhaulen, meaning to drag along the keel, precisely describes the act. The Dutch, known as sea masters in the 17th century, employed keelhauling against those who committed grave infractions: desertion, mutiny, cowardice in battle, or striking an officer. It was meant to serve as both a personal reckoning and a public deterrent. In a time before modern naval codes, keelhauling also fulfilled a psychological function. The isolation of life at sea and the immense authority of ship captains meant that sailors were vulnerable to command abuse. Keelhauling then operated at the volatile intersection of discipline and terror. Long before keelhauling vanished from maritime codes, it left its mark across the decks of both naval and civilian vessels. Dutch warships used it to instill fear and enforce hierarchy. British captains, though more sparing, followed suit. And in the lawless world of piracy, where terror was a tool of command, the punishment found an equally brutal home. As Secretary of the Navy under Louis XIV, 1669-1683, Jean-Baptiste Colbert enforced strict discipline to strengthen France's maritime power, employing tactics such as forced galley labour and harsh penal codes. While pirates operated outside state control, they too resorted to extreme punishments, including, in some accounts, keelhauling, to suppress dissent and maintain order aboard their ships in an era of unforgiving naval conditions. How keelhauling was carried out: step-by-step execution. To understand the sheer brutality of keelhauling, one must first grasp the methodical precision with which it was executed. This was not a chaotic punishment. It was structured, deliberate, and designed to inflict maximum fear, if not death. The ship, the crew, and the very sea itself became instruments of judgment. Keelhauling typically began with the formal reading of the charges against the condemned sailor. Officers, sometimes even the ship's captain, would gather the crew to witness what followed. The sailor was then bound tightly with strong rope, wrists and ankles secured, and a heavy weight often attached to the legs to prevent resistance or floating. 2 lines were used, one fastened to each side of the ship, threaded beneath the keel and attached to the condemned. Depending on the method chosen, the sailor would either be dragged from bow to stern, or more frequently, from one side of the ship to the other, underneath the hull. The journey across or along the keel was harrowing. Wooden ships in the early modern period, Dutch galleons, British frigates, and even pirate sloops, accumulated thick layers of barnacles, coral, and marine growth. These jagged accretions turned the ship's underside into a bed of natural razors. As the sailor was hauled through the water, often by a coordinated effort of seamen pulling ropes from the opposite deck, his body would suffer severe abrasions as it scraped against the jagged hull. Breathing was impossible. Submersion, disorientation, and the pressure of water often caused sailors to swallow seawater, lose consciousness, or convulse. If the condemned survived the first pass, he was sometimes dragged multiple times. In such cases, the ship's surgeon might be present to revive the sailor between passes, not out of mercy, but to ensure the punishment could continue. Pirates, though often viewed as lawless, enforced their own brutal codes. When keelhauling was practiced aboard pirate ships, it was typically for betrayal, informing, desertion, or stealing from fellow crewmen. Black Bart Roberts, one of the Golden Age's most formidable pirate captains, ruled with an iron code, his articles prescribing hanging for desertion and marooning for theft. While keelhauling isn't explicitly listed among his punishments, accounts from the broader pirate world suggest it may have been used in extreme cases. In the anarchic confines of pirate ships, where fear was often the only law, such brutal measures served a single purpose: absolute control. The psychological effect on the watching crew was profound. No amount of shouting or flogging could communicate what a keelhauling silently delivered: obedience through the possibility of annihilation. There was no certainty of death, but there was certainty of agony. Survivors were left mutilated, infected, and traumatized. Salt water worsened injuries. Infection was almost inevitable in the days before antibiotics. Those who died often did so not from drowning, but from the shock of the pain or subsequent fever. Keelhauling was a punishment executed with clinical precision and maritime discipline. Its horror lay not in chaos, but in control, turning the ship into an engine of suffering, its barnacled keel the executioner's blade. This was discipline not just enforced, but engraved on flesh, on memory, and on the iron discipline of life at sea. A banned punishment when history abandoned keelhauling. Even in the brutal world of maritime discipline, keelhauling eventually became too extreme to justify. As Enlightenment thinking began influencing military and naval conduct in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, practices once seen as necessary instruments of authority came under scrutiny. The turning point wasn't just a shift in moral philosophy, it was a strategic recognition that fear alone could no longer maintain effective control aboard a modernizing fleet. The Dutch were the first to phase out keelhauling. Although they had been among its earliest documented practitioners, by the early 1700s, the Dutch Admiralty began replacing the punishment with more structured, less lethal penalties, such as flogging or extended confinement. Pirates, who operated outside the laws of nations, abandoned keelhauling for more immediate methods of punishment as well. As piracy reached its decline in the early 18th century, the pirate code became more pragmatic and, in some cases, more democratic. Mutineers or traitors were often executed swiftly by shooting or hanging. Keelhauling, with its prolonged suffering, lost its function as crews favored efficiency over spectacle. As the 19th century dawned, ships became more complex, crews more professional, and codes of conduct more structured. Naval institutions embraced standardized discipline systems, including recorded punishment logs, training procedures, and regulated courts-martial. Keelhauling exposed how maritime power once relied on spectacle and terror, forging obedience through fear and scarring naval memory. Its abandonment signaled a shift toward discipline shaped by law, proving that punishment molds the societies we build. How do you think the voyage from barnacled keels to codified justice changed humanity's view of authority on sea and shore? Comment below. Its echoes show how terror policed decks long before statutes ruled sea. Cesare Beccaria wrote in 1764, "The certainty of a small punishment will make a stronger impression than the fear of one more severe."